Hi, I'm Max Keiser.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
This is the Keiser Report. Are you psychotic? Stacy?
Well, statistically, one of you or I should be psychotic if you look at this first headline, Max. An unprecedented 1 in 66 Americans is a diagnosed psychotic. Outselling even common drugs to treat high blood pressure and acid reflux, antipsychotic medications are the single top-selling prescription drug in the United States. And they have quite nice names like Zyprexa, Seroquel, Abilify.
Yeah, I told you. This is part of the campaign to breed more Goldman Sachs bankers, because psychosis means that you lack empathy, and you need to be completely devoid of empathy to do your job effectively at Goldman, asset stripping corporations and disenfranchising the population, and doing trades without any thought whatsoever about your actions, what they might have on the effects of society at large. They're breeding psychos.
The other way they've been able to do this is similar to what you see with the economy, because economics, of course, is also a soft science. And what's happened here is pharmaceutical lobbyists and companies have been targeting psychiatrists in order to sell more of this product. And the reason why they've gone to psychiatrists is because this is a soft medical thing. It's all subjective, whether or not the psychiatrist determines that this person in front of them is a psycho. Major pharmaceutical companies, the article says, have been so successful at lobbying psychiatrists that they've changed the criteria for mental illness and disability payments as well. So former New England Journal of Medicine editor Marcia Engel says those qualifying as disabled due to psychosis has increased nearly 2.5 times between 1987 and 2007, from 1 in 184 Americans to 1 in 76. For children, the rise is even more startling, a 35-fold increase in the same 2 decades. Mental illness is now the leading cause of disability in children. 1 in 5 children visiting a psychiatrist now comes away with a prescription for an antipsychotic.
Yeah, well, you see the kids in school now in America. They're trying to force wads of whipped cream up their nostrils, or they're beating their heads against the wall. And this is all considered to be part and parcel of bona fide qualifications to work in the finance industry.
Well, now let's apply this to money. So here we have these private pharmaceutical companies, major corporations. We have a corporatism in America. Corporations run America. Americans are adopted an ideology of fundamentalism that no corporation can ever do anything bad. Nothing they do is ever criminal, right? So you have these corporations able to create mass psychosis. 1 in 66 Americans now psychotic. So let's look at the financial system, the monetary system, where we see the same exact thing. In America, since 1913, we've had the U.S. Federal Reserve System, which is a collection of private banks. So now let's look at the same crises they create in our psychological mind of the whole global monetary system. These are just some screeching headlines, Max, from Monday morning. 24 hours to save the euro. Fearing the worst, Fed prepares for U.S. default. Then Bloomberg headline, Euro leaders start talks on sovereign debt crisis. So here you're seeing the same sort of situation, is that it's all chaos. It's all going to collapse. It's psychotic. Our economy is psychotic. Our monetary system is psychotic. Here, take more debt. We have just the prescription for you.
Debt pills. Yeah, the pharmaceutical companies should start marketing debt in a pill form, so people don't need to wait for their state to impose debt upon them through illegal structuring of re-securitization of debts that they already foisted upon these poor people. They can simply market them as pills, and people can swallow themselves to death, and they can put their intestines into debt. They can put their whole bowels into debt. They can put their stomach into debt. They can put their bodies into debt. They can die from consumption, actual consumption, even before the debt is paid off by the time it makes it through the alimentary canal. It's the perfect scenario for these pharmaceutical banking tyrants.
So here you have these corporations who have determined that you need more debt, and that will solve all of our problems. The financial collapse, the economic collapse, the fact that we have no jobs. Here is the answer: more debt. And let's look at these headlines to show the proof for it. U.S. consumers relying on credit. Consumers in the U.S. are increasingly using credit cards to pay for basic necessities as income gains fail to keep pace with rising food and fuel prices. Now, the biggest rise in credit card purchases has been for gasoline, been an increase of 39% in the last month from the previous year.
Yeah, well, it's similar. You say that they've lowered the threshold in terms of what qualifies as a psychotic so that they can sell them more antipsychotic drugs. Similarly, the government has changed the definition of consumer price index so that according to the new index, which is the 20th or 25th revision going back 20 years or so, the oil and gas are not included. So according to the policymakers, there's no inflation because they don't look at oil and gas. They keep interest rates near zero. And of course, people at home are out there forced to use credit cards to eat, putting themselves more into debt, which is making them psychotic, forcing them to buy more antipsychotic pills, which are collateralized by future psychosis. The entire global economy, in particular America, is collateralized by future psychosis that's being sold forward by the pharmaceutical bankers today on Wall Street as a way to make sure that they get huge Christmas bonuses this year so they can afford a higher class of prostitute next year.
So in this article, they speak to David Rosenberg, chief economist at Gluskin Sheff and Associates in Toronto, and he says, basically referring to Ben Bernanke, who saw positive signs in all the increase in credit card usage. Rosenberg says, for people to think that this rebound in credit card usage is actually a sign of resurging consumer confidence, I think they're looking at the situation backwards. So applying this to the method we've seen in the pharmaceutical industries, Max, we see that in the pharmaceutical industries, they look at the population of children in America and they say, let's create a problem for them. We'll call them psychotics and then we can sell them more drugs. In America, they looked at the population of people without jobs and they said, let's call those people a good credit risk and give them more debt. And this is exactly what they've done on the global stage as well. They looked at Greece, they looked at Portugal, and they said, yes, let's join them into the euro and the common currency area with Germany, and let's make them compete with Germany and give them all the debt they need to compete with Germany.
Well, Bernanke is obviously a psychotic, and so is Trichet, and so is more of the people who are now orchestrating this global bailout. They're not taking their meds as they should. At Davos or the IMF or the G20, these are conventions of deeply psychotic individuals who are not taking their meds.
That's the problem, is actually the medicines are being given, the prescription drugs, the antipsychotics are being given to normal people, when it's the psychotics are the ones in these corporations at the private banks, at the central bank, who are psychotic, and they're seeing in the rest of the population their own illness in their own mind and projecting it on us and making us endure their psychosis.
Yes, it's basically, as I mentioned, it's a collateralizing psychosis today for Christmas bonuses tomorrow and a higher class of prostitutes the year after that.
So let's look again at this psychosis of the global debt situation being, operated by the likes of Ben Bernanke and other people behind him. Jonathan Weil, half of B of A's book value is bogus. At $9.85 a share, down 26% this year, Bank of America finished yesterday with a market capitalization of $99.8 billion. That's an astonishingly low 49% of the company's $205.6 billion book value or common shareholder equity as of June 30th. So basically what they're saying is that more than half of the company's book value is bogus due to overstated assets, understated liabilities, or some combination of the two.
Right, and we could take that one step further and say that if you were to take all of the debts that Bank of America and these other banks have parked onto the balance sheet of the Fed, and you return them back to where they came, onto the balance sheet of Bank of America, Goldman, JP Morgan, their book value would be zero. These are not really banks. These are financial holograms that exist only in the figmentation of psychotic central bankers like Ben Bernanke who are off their meds. Once we hit peak antipsychotic and we see the true nature of a Ben Bernanke, I fully expect him to run naked around Ron Paul, swinging a tambourine and singing some old Carpenter song while having his entire body waxed by a dominatrix. That's pretty much what we can look forward to at his next congressional testimony.
You create the problem in order to sell your product, right? So let's look at these final headlines. Europe is tanking as the words selective default hit the wires. That was first thing Monday morning. The euro tanked, gold and euro soared, and then out from Brussels, the meeting in Brussels, came this tweet from the Telegraph. The new jargon buzz phrase here in Brussels is temporary rather than selective default. What does it mean? And what the Telegraph journalist found was that one Ernst Commission source says, see the Standard & Poor's definition, it means hours or days, this temporary default that Greece will have. Another more honest Nordic diplomat has just told me, no one knows what it means. It sounds nice and they want to sound nice. Again, like Abilify sounds nice for an antipsychotic drug.
Yes, and the only player in all this that's not fooled, of course, is gold, continuing to hit new all-time highs in every currency around the world, because the gold vigilantes don't play that antipsychotic stuff. They're in it for real.
And I want to make another point about this European debt crisis and what they're doing to Greece. You look at what the Finns and the Germans are basically allied against any of these bailouts, but the Finns are proposing that Greece collateralize now this 300 billion euros worth of property, of state assets, actual property in Greece. And now, remember, so right now, Greece owes a couple hundred billion euros, but it's non-recourse, i.e. they could just default and walk away. And this sounds like the help that, remember, Timothy Geithner and Obama offered U.S. mortgage holders who held non-recourse home mortgage loans that they couldn't pay, and then they could just send the keys in and walk away. Then they offered that HAMP, that modification program. Well, what it did is it changed it to a recourse program, and they could pursue you for the rest of your life. And this is what we see happening in Europe. Again, they've created the problem. It's they who created the problem, and they're forcing more debt onto you to make it even worse.
Yeah, what if the people finally woke up and the antipsychotic medicine wore off and they realized that they're being held hostage by a bunch of corrupt bankers, and all they need to do is to default and they'll be free?
Well, the equivalent of the antipsychotic medication to make people SOMA'd is debt, is cheap debt. So they're SOMA'd. They think everything is okay in the financial system.
Yeah, plus in the ECB with all the semantics about saying it's an easy bailout, it's a modified bailout, it's a SOMA bailout. All that means is basically that the ECB and the Bundesbank and all these bankers in Europe that we're against inflation, they gave up that hope. They're totally for inflation, and they're drinking the Kool-Aid, but in this case, it's the antipsychotic medicine. You need to stop taking that stuff and get real with your economies. Listen to Stacy Herbert. She knows what's going on over there. When are you going to Brussels to straighten those people out, Stacy? I want to see that.
I'm going to New York. That's where the heart of the financial center is, Max.
Is that what?
Forget Brussels.
What about me? Can I come?
Why don't you come with me?
Really? When?
I have to go now, Max. Bye, y'all.
Permission free. Accreditation free. Transport charges free. Arrangement free. Risk free. Stereotype free. Download free broadcast quality video for your media projects at freevideo.rt.com.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Argentina and talk with independent consultant on risk management and author of the new ebook, The Coming World Government, Tragedy and Hope, Adrian Salbucci. Welcome to the show, Adrian.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Before I ask you about your new book, I want to ask you about Greece. Is the nature of the financial attack on Greece similar to what happened in Argentina in 2001, 2002?
Well, sadly, yes, because we are seeing almost a copy of exactly what happened in Argentina. The major difference being that what happened in Argentina in 2001 and 2002 could be just limited to only affecting Argentina. So they just let us fall and crash, and Argentina's GDP fell 40% in just 1 year, and 50% of the population fell below the poverty line, whilst in Greece, it is so tied into the euro that they cannot take the liberty of allowing Greece to fall just like that. Otherwise, they would. It's the difference between having your own currency and having somebody else's currency.
Right. So in the case of Greece or Ireland, or even it looks like Italy and looks like Spain will be sucked into this vortex of deceit. The banks, the major global banks, the international banks, they get the local governments like Papandreou to commit fraud on behalf of the banks, to load the economies up with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt. In the case of Greece, we're talking now 500 billion euros in debt that was illegally parked onto their balance sheet. And then when they can't pay back the debt, they take all their assets as recompense for the debts that they never incurred. But you're saying the big difference, of course, is that in Greece, they're part of the Eurozone, so you have this contagion effect, whereas in Argentina, it was a self-contained economy, and it was a bit of a silo effect that just happened within the confines of that economy, correct?
Exactly. So, yeah, that's exactly the point. We have to see above everything that this is really all part of a model. We are dealing with a global power elite, whether you're in Argentina, whether you're in Greece, whether you're in Britain, or even in the United States, a global power elite that is above all nation states. That's why for many decades now, they have declared public enemy number one, the sovereign nation state, which is the only institution that can really stand up to them. And what they seek time and again is to fully control nations. Now, each nation has a different characteristic that will enable it to be controlled. Some nations need to be controlled through outright military invasion, but that looks very bad on the 6 o'clock news, as we learned from Iraq and from Vietnam many decades ago. So what they do is they finance and install caretaker governments where the presidents and prime ministers basically act as chief executive officers, and then through them, they get them to enact the necessary measures and laws that will indebt a country like Argentina or Greece, and then they come in and say, you can't pay back. They never could pay back, so you're going to have to refinance, increase our balance sheet assets, and they just kick it over, roll it over, and at the same time they are able to impose their agenda through the local caretaker governments so that they can suck in all the wealth of Argentina, the natural resources, and the same happens with Greece, and we are seeing that the world over, where all profits are privatized and all losses are socialized.
Now, in the case of the Eurozone, it's kind of interesting in that you've got the contagion effect, and it's spreading to other economies, slightly larger economies. Of course, Greece is a $300 billion economy. It's not even as big as Apple, the software and computer company. It's not as big as Exxon, one U.S. company. Or you have Ireland, similarly, it's a $200 or $300 billion economy. Spain is, of course, obviously a larger economy than that, but still not a significantly larger economy. So you've got this contagion spreading. However, at the center of the Eurozone is Germany, and Germany benefits from this catastrophe because of the lower euro. It helps their export market. Now, how can Germany be guaranteed that they, by participating in the wholesale financial rape of Greece, how can Germany protect itself from the contagion wiggling its way into Germany? Or did they haven't thought that far and they're simply going to be swallowed up by this financial contagion?
Well, I think, Max, there are two levels of interpretation. First of all, from the national point of view, from Germany's point of view, and I should even say Germany and France, since Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, together with European Central Bank President Jean-Claude Trichet, have agreed on a common stance on the upcoming negotiations regarding Greece. On a national stance, yes, they do perhaps look at the short-term benefit that they might get from balancing the euro out, stabilizing matters, and so forth. But I still believe, and I insist on this, that there is a global power structure that is way above Berlin, way above Paris, even way above London and Washington, although they might operate from those capitals, that have other longer-term plans in mind. Personally, I believe that it has a lot to do with the introduction of a global currency, which will not be in the hands of any one sovereign nation. Now, to transition towards that global currency, and Germany knows this very well because they're part of the game, will require the controlled demise of both the dollar and the euro. So the dollar's demise will come through hyperinflation. Quantitative easing 1, 2, and coming 3 has already hyperinflated the dollar, and we know a lot about hyperinflation in Argentina because we went through it in 1989. Whilst the way to break up the euro when the right time comes is just breaking it up, because it is not hyperinflated. However, it is politically weak, because if Greece were to pull out and Spain were to pull out and Portugal were to pull out, maybe even the Germans might decide to go back to the old Deutschmark because it would might even make life easier for them. But their governments are so aligned to this global agenda that they wouldn't dare do that unless they are told by their bosses.
All right, currently what we're hearing out of Brussels and the confab made up of the leaders of various countries and these international organizations is that they want to expand the concept of a European credit facility. They want to create a new lending facility which would be, let's say, 10 to 20 trillion euros in size. And going back to the Davos conference of the past year, it was discussed that to solve the global financial crisis, a new lending facility of $100 trillion needs to be created. So the policymakers and these global institutions, their answer is always exactly the same. More debt, more loans, more interest cost, more fees for bankers. Is it inevitable that hyperinflation visits the global economy, as we saw in Argentina? Is that a done deal in your view?
In a way, what Argentina or I as an Argentine citizen can bring to the table is first-hand experience at mass devaluations, hyperinflation, and systemic banking collapses. I think, first of all, one of the things that I say very often to my people down here is, how can a country or an organization or even an individual that has as his basic problem a debt problem, how can you solve a debt problem by incurring even more debt? So the fact that they are setting up all these slush funds of billions and hundreds of billions and even trillions of dollars merely shows that they are dead set on making the game roll on, roll on, and roll on. This is like a merry-go-round. They need to have the whole debt paradigm embedded into our minds, embedded into our systems, whilst what they do is they ensure that people don't realize that if we were to make good, proper use of public money, and by public money I mean the actual sovereign currency that any state can issue, which is non-interest bearing because it is banking interest that is at fault when it comes to the major source of inflation, I think that we have to look and say, well, are these just a series of very bad mistakes, or is there a plan behind this? And I personally believe, and that's what my book deals with, there is a plan behind this. And the plan is basically to set up a world government which needs to transition away from globalization and towards a more formal world government. And I know we have very little time, but I think the point, especially to our American friends, to say is that just as when the global power elite decided to move from the bipolar post-World War II world towards globalization 21 years ago, they had to engineer the demise of the former Soviet Union. Now, as they are wrapping up globalization and ushering in world government, which is what I describe in my book, the other superpower has to go. It's the United States of America that they now need to go into the waste bin of history, because a formal world government cannot tolerate that any one major nation state, sovereign nation state, should still be in existence, because we've had the Bushes and the Clintons and the Obamas in power, and they've been very aligned to the global power elite. But what would happen if a true patriot were to make it to the White House? So in a way, I think that what we are seeing is not only the engineering of the demise of the dollar and the euro to replace it by a global currency, but even the geopolitical demise of the United States of America, which might help to explain why their problems will only get worse in the coming weeks and months.
Right. Well, S&P and the other rating agencies are already talking about downgrading U.S. debt, and other foreign rating agencies have already downgraded U.S. debt. So they're tenderizing the meat, so to speak, before they cook it. And the downgrade of U.S. debt is baked into the cake, to use another cooking metaphor. And yes, the U.S. will lose its predominance in the global economy, and anyone who's not a U.S. citizen, the other 95% of the world's population, of course, would benefit from that. Now, finally, let me just return to Argentina for a second. How did Argentina deal with its banker infestation problem? How did it get rid of the banking scum?
Well, we didn't. It's still here. One of the, as a key example, which is even worse in America, during our 2001-2002 systemic banking, financial, and currency meltdown, as I said, the people suffered huge amounts of hardship. They went out into the street. They banged on the doors of the banks, which were very, very hermetically shut closed. And yet, when the whole crisis was over, not one single bank, Max, not one single bank folded, although millions of Argentinians lost their homes, lost their savings, etc., lost their pensions, and so forth. So in a way, they use psychological warfare because they know that people end up getting used to whatever comes to them. It's basic human psychology. In a way, the great advantage that Argentina certainly has, and that Ireland, Spain, Italy, even Greece do not have, is that Argentina is immensely wealthy from its natural resources. We are a country that is the 8th territory in the world. We should have 140 million people, and yet we are only 40 million. And look at the irony, a small population in an immensely wealthy territory, and yet half the population is below the poverty level. This clearly shows that there is a plan, there is a basic agenda, because then when you see when other countries run into trouble, whether it be Brazil and Mexico at the end of the 90s, Greece, Ireland, Iceland, Portugal, Italy, and Spain, now in Europe, even the United States, you see the same pattern coming time and again. And when you see the same pattern, it's because there's a model. And when there is a model, A, somebody is planning it, and B, most important, a model is predictable. So it's very important we start to understand how the model works so that it can become predictable, and we can take the necessary measures to mitigate and even to compensate all these coming woes that are affecting practically every country. Today it's Greece, tomorrow it'll be Britain and even America.
All right, Adrian Salbushi, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. My pleasure.
All righty, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.